Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Rabbi,
Uh,
when will this be posted online, this class?
It should be within about 24 hours.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
usually, usually it's not, there isn't much of a delay on that. It's usually like next day. So, yeah, yeah. Um, Usually maybe a day or two later is when I get to, changing the thumbnail on it
Hmm.
because when they give you when YouTube gives me a little thumbnail, when it says, it gives you a picture of uh, what the video is. Usually, it's basically a snapshot of this
Hmm.
that we're not necessarily posing for. So, I try to change it to that, and I also I want to make sure that like the title is consistent with other titles that I've done, as opposed to now I just sort of, you know, put sort of a placeholder. But yeah, that's the
Okay,
basic idea.
yeah. I've got to leave in a few minutes, so
No worries, no worries. So, yeah, so hopefully the next day. Um, so, um, Today we're going to be talking about, we're going to be talking about the process of mourning, of Shiva, and how one deals with things after death, and what uh, before we get to that, I should also note that uh, regarding the next couple of weeks, um, next week we're going to be talking about Purim, which is going to be a very abrupt shift from talking about mourning, because of Purim, sort of the sort of the jolliness of Purim, which we celebrated in a very um, silly and funny way, even though there are serious, important aspects to it. That'll be next Sunday. 2 Sundays from now, we're not going to have a session because I, along with a number of people on this class right now, um, and others will be at the Southern Schmooze weekend at Camp Ramada Rome. So we are going to be off the last. So what's today? The 15th. So March 1st, we're not going to have a session.
I
Um,
think there's still time to sign up if you'd like to go to Southern Schmooze and you're a member of Heskemuna Synagogue.
I agree. I think it's not too late. So if there's room, yeah, please. So it should be a very fun weekend. When we resume again, we're going to be doing sort of the final session of life cycle, which is going to be the afterlife, um, and different views on the afterlife. Not that we really know what that necessarily is going to be like, but we're going to be talking about Jewish ideas of it. It's honestly, it's one of the questions that I feel like I get as a rabbi more than anybody else, more than anything else. So that will be something we can delve into. So, um, and anyway, that's what's going to be happening over the next handful of weeks. Um, uh, Certainly, it's important to acknowledge for our purposes today that we're talking about um, death and mourning, noting that we are sending our condolences once again to Mark Foreman on the passing of his mother uh, this past week. And so, uh, obviously, we have people who are dealing with some of these questions and this topic very directly right now. Others of you may never have dealt with this on a personal level, on a direct level, and then still others. you have experience, having done so in the past. So we all come into this at sort of at different points. So what I try to do is not necessarily dictate how exactly everyone um, has acted, should act, anything like that. I just want to give the basic ideas, the basic, um, uh, sort of the principles and customs behind it, and then we can kind of go from there. Betty and Mark, you had a question?
Um, well, when you were talking about the weeks ahead, I just wanted to make sure that the members of Heskamuna knew that next week, immediately following this class, will be the congregational meeting for the express purpose of voting on extension of the rabbi's contract. And it's always fun because you never really know if you're going to get a quorum at those meetings. And since there's no controversy, it might be difficult. So there will be a Zoom option, and so we would welcome your participation.
Okay, I certainly appreciate it. All right, well, thank you. Um, okay, so regarding mourning, I think what we got up to um, last time, which granted was 3 weeks ago, we had a couple of um, just due to the calendar, we had a couple of different one-time topics that we tackled in between that. So if you want to look back at when we talked about uh, rituals of death, of immediately following death, and the funeral, you can look to the class we did 3 weeks ago. Um, so where I'm going to kind of start is what happens after the funeral is done. That's where we're going to pick up. What a general idea that is very important to keep in mind with all of this is that so many of the rules and customs that I'm going to explain, they are there for for the mourner's benefit. Meaning, I don't want to make it, if I describe something and if you're in a position to mourn for somebody, and if you're not doing things exactly as I describe, it's okay. It's okay. Nobody is, no one in their right mind is going to be monitoring what you're doing to make sure that you're doing everything correct. Um, these are directives to help you, we hope, cope with a loss. So if I mention something and then you say to yourself, oh, but I didn't do that, or oh, I should have done that, if I were in a prior situation like that, don't be hard on yourself. And, or if you say, oh gosh, you know what? This rule, I don't buy it. I don't, it, or that's not going to work for me. Okay. That's okay. It's all done for your benefit, for the sake of hopefully making that journey a little easier. So I just want to make sure that that's understood from the top. Okay. There is a tradition that when the funeral is done, that either you go directly to your home or wherever you're going to be sitting Shiva, and I'll explain what that is in a moment, or you're going to a place. Sometimes it's a synagogue, sometimes it's someone else's home, in which there has been a meal prepared for you. This is known as the Seudah Mafseket, essentially the meal of consolation. Sitting Shiva is a process that, in I would say, the most traditional circles, and what I encourage, if it is possible for you, to take place over the course of 7 days. The first of those days includes the day of the funeral. There are people who have, for various reasons, have observed Shiva over a shorter period of time. Again, no judgments on that. The traditional time period is 7 days. Shiva is directly related to the Hebrew word for the number 7, Sheva. So that's why we call it sitting Shiva. Well, why do we call it sitting? Well, the idea is that over the course of that time, you're essentially sitting. I'm not saying that he never stand up literally, but what I'm saying is that you're basically staying home or staying at one location, ideally, and you're suspending regular activities. You're giving yourself time to deal with emotions. You're also enabling people to visit, to come by, to spend time with you. It is considered a great mitzvah to go to somebody's home or to wherever one is sitting Shiva. There are a bunch of different rules having to do with what you're allowed to do during Shiva and what you're not allowed to do during Shiva. Again, I think these fall under the categories of this is done for your benefit. If it is possible, the idea is that you wouldn't go to work during the time of Shiva. For some people, that's not a feasible reality. I respect that. Hopefully, one's employer will give you at least a little bit of time to, to be able to grieve for a loss. Sometimes it's just very difficult to get that kind of time off, depending on what the rules of your place of employment might be. But the idea of not working during the course of Shiva, again, it's done for your benefit, so that you're not necessarily jumping right back into life right away. It's to give yourself time to deal with stuff. There are certain customs having to do with when one is sitting Shiva, let's say at one's home. One that you may have heard of is to cover the mirrors. Now, why would you be covering the mirrors? It's because you're not supposed to be worrying about how you look over the course of the week. And again, the idea is It's so that you can have one thing off of your regular checklist just removed, so you don't have to think about it. Another one is that usually people bring you food, so that you don't have to think about cooking. Another one is, at least when people are coming by, to leave your door unlocked, if that's practical to do. So people can just come. You don't have to worry about getting the door when somebody, if somebody knocks or rings the doorbell, people can just come in. Another one, and this may be a little more difficult these days, but it's to have somebody else answer your phone. Now, in the days of text messaging and all these sorts of things, I don't know how I don't know how practical that is. I should mention before I go on that I have only dealt with this in my professional capacity. In other words, I have only dealt with this as a rabbi helping to guide others through their Shiva process. I have not yet had to sit Shiva myself. So I want to acknowledge that, because if there's a moment where I may say something that is naive, that is that I can't say from direct experience, people should feel free to people should feel free to not necessarily correct me, but to at least acknowledge other ways of this. So I want to be sensitive, but I should acknowledge that I have not dealt with all these things myself. Another custom, if it's possible, and it depends on what the patterns of the community might be, is that is to provide a minyan, is to provide a prayer quorum at the home of the person who is sitting Shiva. And that way they can recite the mourner's Kaddish, fulfill that obligation without having to leave their home. So a couple of notes about general comportment. First, as the mourner. Obviously, a time of mourning is a sensitive one and complex. And in many cases, obviously very sad. That's not to say that if you want to remember a funny story about somebody, it's not like those stories are off limits. If there are people who, if there are conversations that you have where you want to laugh about something in a nostalgic way or just otherwise, that's okay. You as the mourner don't have to feel, well, you don't necessarily have to feel anything that you don't want to feel. In other words, if you want to tell an amusing story about the one that you're missing, okay. It's not off limits. The idea is to feel your feelings. You don't have to be dour at every moment if you don't feel that you have that you feel dour at every moment. It's okay to process things as you need. Now, in terms of somebody who is visiting a Shiva home, or paying a Shiva call, as we often call it, one should go in without any assumptions. Don't be surprised, obviously, if the mood is very sad. Don't be surprised if the mood is not necessarily as sad as you might expect, depending on what the people need to feel. Don't go in with any expectations. Another custom that I feel is important is, and this goes along with the idea of not making any assumptions. When you go into the Shiva home, and especially when you approach somebody who is sitting Shiva, they might want to talk. They might not want to talk. Either way is okay. The custom is to not start the conversation. Let the mourners start the conversation. I know that might feel awkward, but sometimes you just go up to the person and you just stand for a moment. Oftentimes the person who is mourning will be happy to talk. And then you can take the conversation wherever it goes. The thing you want to avoid, that we all want to avoid, is resorting to platitudes, many of which can be taken can be very insensitive, even if you don't mean for them to be insensitive. For instance, at least the person who has died is in a better place. You might mean that in the kindest, sweetest way possible. I'm sure you would mean it if you said that. And that might very well be what a mourner wants to hear. But it might not. Because they might say, well, what better place is there than being here right now? Don't assume that that's what a mourner needs to hear. Don't assume that they'd want to hear something like, time heals all wounds. Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know that. You don't know that. God wouldn't give you anything that you couldn't handle. Do we know that for sure? Again, any of those things, I'm sure if you were to say them, you would mean it with love and affection. It just might not be what people want to hear at that moment. Better to let a mourner lead the conversation. And if that conversation winds up being very short, okay. Sometimes they just need a hug or just a nod to let them know that you're here. don't make any assumptions. I think is sort of the best way to do it. And then you'll read the room and you'll see. What I should mention also is, especially for those who may be on the Zoom right now, watching on YouTube, what have you, I want to, there is a misconception that has gone on, which is that if someone converts to Judaism, chooses Judaism, sometimes there is a concern about, okay, if I then lose a loved one who isn't Jewish, do I not participate in mourning for that person? You are absolutely entitled to mourn for anyone in your family, for those in your family, whether they were Jewish or not, which I think is a good thing. To give you time to process it, because a loss is still a loss, no matter what.
Rabbi, would you still sit Shiva for 7 days or at all if you, because, okay, my wife's not Jewish, so if she passes away, yes, obviously I'm going to mourn, but do I need to sit Shiva? Would I light a Yorkshire candle each year?
The tradition is that you would. The tradition is that you would treat it as any loss. So, fair question.
I don't think I did that for my husband. He wasn't Jewish. I don't think I sat Shiva. But I do light a Yorkshire candle every year.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Listen. Again, all of this is to not evaluate or to judge what you may have done or what you will do in the future. When dealing with loss, right? I mean, this is not to cast judgment. This is all about just what the tradition indicates. And I, again, feel that it really is, it can be a gift to be able to have time to process it. When I was in rabbinical school, one of my professors, his father passed away. I was in the midst of taking a class from that professor, and he was living in in Westchester County. So one of the days of Shiva, I took a train to White Plains and paid him a Shiva call. And he was very appreciative, very gracious, of course, and he says to me, he's like, I didn't have the best relationship with my father. So I thought to myself before Shiva started, okay, I'll sit, but then, I'll get some work done. I'll catch up on my reading, I'll, what have you. And then he said, but what I've discovered is that this has really been a great opportunity to not only see people that maybe I haven't seen in a little while, or haven't had a chance to really talk to in a while. And it's given me a chance to think, to think about my dad and to think about, about good times too. So, I will also, I'll give you as a counterexample. I guess you'd say my former father-in-law, my ex-wife's dad, when his mother died, and I was married at the time, we did the funeral, And, he's somebody who I would say, I don't think he would say that he's a particularly observant Jew. He certainly feels an identity and he does some things, but, there are other things he doesn't necessarily do. But what he decided was, um, he had found out um, he had found out that his mother's his mother was going to die, maybe about 3 days before it happened. And his feeling was, okay, I cried then. He felt that the one thing he needed after the funeral was, and this is very New York, was to go to a diner and to just be surrounded by family and friends and to share a meal together. That was what he did for Shiva. Was it traditional? No. Was it what he needed? Yeah. And I respect that. It's not what I, as a rabbi, would advise. Like if somebody were to say, hey, how should I approach this? I would recommend Shiva. But he knew himself well enough to know that that's not what was going to work for him psychologically. And whether that's, whether that's what I would choose for myself when I'm going to be put in that situation in the future, whether that's going to work for me, that probably wouldn't. But I'm not him. So again, it's important to be unassuming throughout all of this. Okay, so I've described a bit about Shiva. Questions at the moment. Obviously, you can feel free to ask at other points, but another custom I forgot to mention regarding Shiva, which may be actually one of the most well-known customs, is that if your health allows it, is to sit low to the ground or lower to the ground than you ordinarily would. So so sometimes people will have like, low stools that you would sit in. What I've actually done before is that I've seen people use, like if they have like little kids, if they have those, like a little chair and table sets, and when they're playing, they'll actually sit in those little plastic chairs, or put a cushion on the ground and just sit on that cushion. If somebody were to say, "Gosh, it's just going to kill my back," what have you? Okay, then sit as you normally would. That's fine. But again, that's sort of part of the custom, is to just recognize the different space that you're in. When Shiva concludes, there is a custom to walk around the block of the street you live.
I'd have to hike 3 miles.
So maybe you do a quick saunter or something like that. But the idea is to get outside and to begin to say, all right, well, this is all right. So I need to begin to move forward. Now, this doesn't mean that the loss that you feel will be any less heavy. But it does mean that hopefully there are elements of reality that you can begin to recognize. Part of the psychological brilliance that I think exists in the laws of mourning for Judaism is that it recognizes that we need mechanisms to remember, and we also need mechanisms to keep our lives moving, and that there is a time for both. So from Shiva, that's the 7 days after mourning. That's 7 days after the funeral. Then Shiva is also the initial period of what's called Shloshim, which is the 30 days following the death. Shloshim literally means 30. Shloshim, it's kind of a lighter mode of Shiva. And there are still things that you wouldn't do that correspond with Shiva, but there are other things that you begin to do again. Probably the most prominent of which is that you go back to work. If you've been missing work for Shiva, that you go back to work. But one also tries to avoid other leisurely activities. So one would, let's say, not go to movies or parties or concerts. One would avoid, just think about typical sort of leisurely things that one does. The idea is to not do those things. Now, there are times where there are previously scheduled things that can be very hard to miss. For instance, let's say you suffer a loss, and then 2 weeks later, you have a wedding in your family. It happens. How do you handle it? There's no one simple formula of how you handle that. What I've seen people do is they've attended, but purposely not stayed for the entirety of the celebration. So there's a recognition of life moving forward, but also that you need time. I had a congregant in Charleston who had an interesting dilemma that I really appreciate the way that she handled it. She had lost her mother. She was somebody who, she had been married for a time. Her husband died relatively young, and then later in life, she had been part of a committed, loving relationship. They never married, but they were very much together for a number of years. So during her time of mourning for her mother, her partner's granddaughter celebrated a bat mitzvah. Now, she was very close to this family and a tremendous influence on the young lady who celebrated her bat mitzvah. So what do you do? Here's what she did. Now, going to services, you can always go to services. So going to the bat mitzvah itself, there was no issue. The party, how did she handle that? She talked to the caterer at the party. She went into the kitchen and said, I need you to let me work a little bit. She explained what was going on, and she said, okay, can I stir the soup? Can I, what have you? And he said, okay. She was able to justify her presence at her quasi-granddaughter's party by working the party, even for a brief time. This way, she was able to take a moment and honor the place that she was in, honor her mother's memory, and also be able to participate in a happy moment that meant a lot for her to be there.
Okay, Rabbi, that's very interesting that you say that, because I thought one of the principles of this period of time is we're not supposed to work or do other things that are part of normal activity.
Right. So had this happened during Shiva, I think that would not have been an adequate solution.
Okay.
Like during Shiva, I would figure that she would still be sitting Shiva. This was during this, Shloshim period afterwards, where there is more leeway. Yeah, good question. So that's how she was able to square that circle.
So
Now,
I know Shiv is 7 days.
yeah.
It seems like I recalled that you do the Yorkshire prayer. Is it every week for a year?
So Mourner's Kaddish.
Mourner's Kaddish.
Right. Yes. Okay. So Mourner's Kaddish. Yeah. So, I will get to that in a moment. But
Okay.
yes, I will. But
Okay.
I will absolutely talk about Kaddish. So good question, Laura.
Yeah, so Shloshim is 30 days.
Mhm.
But I have a friend who's, after her mother passed, she would not do anything enjoyable for an entire year until it was time for her mother's unveiling. Is that a custom that is, in general, you've seen a lot of people practice, or was it just, I mean, she was very devastated by the loss of her mother, and I didn't know if that was just because she decided she would just take the whole year off until the unveiling, or if that's something you've seen other people practice.
That is something that I've seen people practice. So, so Shloshim, it ends after 30 days, and regarding the year, the rest of the year, following a death, it goes one of two ways. One is to if you've, and this typically is done specifically if you've lost a parent. There are many customs to essentially extend Shloshim for an entire year if you've lost a parent specifically. Not necessarily if you've lost a sibling, a spouse, or one's child. Now, with that said, a colleague of mine, his daughter died in an accident. He maintained the Shloshim customs for a year. No one would blame them. No one would blame him, obviously. I mean, listen, that's where I think, again, it was not mandatory according to traditional Jewish law, but entirely understandable and fully respectful. People are fully respectful of that. So yeah, so there are those who will maintain the general directives of Shloshim for a full year. The one thing that, regardless of whether one does that or not, is, as Mark asked, about saying Kaddish. We talked a while back about what a Kaddish is. There are different forms of Kaddish. A prayer that essentially says that we must sanctify God's name. The half Kaddish or Chatzi Kaddish is recited when we are beginning a portion of services. The full Kaddish, Kaddish Shalem, is said when we are concluding a portion of our service. So there are a lot of Kaddishes. The most famous Kaddish, though, is the Mourner's Kaddish. And the idea is that one says Kaddish to commemorate the loss of a loved one. In the year following the loss, one recites Kaddish, and again, you can only say a Kaddish if there is a minyan, if there are 10 adult Jews gathered. Sorry, there are kids playing outside. If you hear that, sorry. You can only say it with a minyan, which is, by the way, one of the great motivations and motivators to get people to come to services at times, so that there is a minyan for people who need to say Kaddish can do so. And honestly, the ideal is to recite Kaddish every possible opportunity you have, every possible opportunity for prayer. So, and people will do this in different ways, right? Sometimes they'll say, you know what, I'm not a shul goer. I don't typically go to synagogue. But I'm going to go every week now. I'm going to go every week. At least I'm going to go once a week and make sure to say Kaddish then. There are those who don't necessarily make a point of going to services every week, but they'll say, all right, whenever I'm in services during that year, I'll say Kaddish then. But the ideal is to make a point of being at services whenever possible, and to hopefully be able to say Kaddish whenever you can. That is the ideal.
Is
Please.
that year based on the Gregorian calendar or on the Hebrew calendar?
Excellent question. It's on the Hebrew calendar. And there's something else that I should mention regarding that, which is that the custom is to not do so for 12 months. It's actually to do it for 11 months. It ties in with something we're going to talk about when we talk about Jewish views of the afterlife. To give you a sneak preview of that, there is one theory of the afterlife that proposes the idea that one's soul, after one dies, one's soul is being cleansed for a maximum of 1 year. However, it needs to be cleansed as much as it needs to be cleansed. In other words, if your soul needs a lot of cleansing, it might take all year. If your soul doesn't need all that much cleansing, then, it's probably a lot less. So there is an idea that when we're saying Kaddish, we are raising up the soul. We are speaking on behalf of that soul that is being cleansed.
Rabbi, don't they call that the transition period when the soul is transitioning for 11 months? Is that why they do the 11 months?
Yeah. So that's the idea. And again, we'll talk about this more when we talk about afterlife. But the idea is to say for 11 months, because if you did it all 12 months, you'd be assuming that the person you're saying Kaddish for needs the whole time to have their soul to have their soul cleansed, which we don't want to necessarily assume that it's like, oh my, it's like, so we set it at 11 months because we don't want to assume that that person that you're saying Kaddish for needs the maximum time.
Isn't that when they have the unveiling too after 11 months?
Right. Well, 11 months, a year. So oftentimes it's around a year. So an unveiling is when we have a dedication for the headstone. Usually it's a headstone. Every once in a while it's a footstone, but depending on what's at the cemetery. You can put up a headstone anytime after 30 days. You can do so, anytime beforehand. Anytime, once you've hit the 30-day mark. But usually people wait until around the time of the first yahrzeit, of the first anniversary of somebody's passing. Usually that's when people try to do it. An unveiling it's meant to be a fairly brief thing. Whenever I work with a family and talk to them about an unveiling, I try to remind them that this is not meant to be the funeral part 2, right? It's not, or it's really not meant to be a replay of the funeral. What I usually say is the idea that we are, by gathering for an unveiling, we are setting a marker. We are setting a literal marker in the ground made of stone. But we are also marking time and marking that since we were last here, if you will, since we were here for the funeral, that time has passed. And we've changed, at least to an extent. An unveiling, obviously will sometimes trigger, feelings of sadness of and of loss, understandably. But the idea is that in many cases it feels different. An unveiling does, some people make an unveiling a very public thing. They invite the congregation, they invite a lot of people to come by. For some people, an unveiling is they just want to do it privately. It's okay. There and the ceremony itself usually and really ought to be pretty brief. When I do unveilings, unless people have a lot of things to say, unless a lot of people want to talk, I'd say 15 minutes. It doesn't have to be a long, something long and drawn out. The custom then is that you'd be done reciting Kaddish after 11 months, but then every year at the yard site, then you would try to say Kaddish on the anniversary of one's death, of a loved one's death. So I, as I mentioned, I have not yet sat Shiva. However, my my grandparents, who have all passed, I do say Kaddish for them at their yard site. And as well, one thing I didn't mention, but I should try to at least throw in with the couple minutes we have left here, there is a service known as Yizkor. Yizkor, coming from the Hebrew word zachar, meaning remembrance. Yizkor is a part of a service that takes place 4 times a year. We say Yizkor on Yom Kippur, and we say Yizkor on the final day of the 3 pilgrimage festivals. We say it on Shmini Atzeret, which is technically, at least in some ways, the last day of Sukkot. We say it on the final day of Passover, and then we say it on the second day, the last day of Shavuot. Yizkor is a brief portion of the service that we stop, we reflect, and say Kaddish for all of our loved ones who have passed. So that takes place at 4 services over the course of a year. So those are other times in which we say Kaddish for a loved one. But again, those are more, those are sort of, we say it sort of as a, as a collective Kaddish for people who have passed. We've reached the conclusion here of our session today, and I know it's a tough topic. It's a somber topic to speak of. But again, I want to return to this idea that I feel like there's a lot of psychological soundness to these customs. The idea of having an intense time of mourning followed by a time where things are not quite as intense, giving people space to deal with their emotions, giving people ritual to help bring order in a time of emotional chaos. As I understand it, these rules have a great deal of resonance for Jews and non-Jews alike. In fact, as I understand it, I was always taught that one of the most famous converts to Judaism, Sammy Davis Jr., the legendary entertainer, began to be interested in Judaism when he learned about the laws of mourning, and he saw Jewish friends going through Shiva and saying Kaddish and things like that. And he became interested in Judaism because he's like, this just makes a lot of sense. So I would say that, listen, when those times come, some of it's going to, work for you. Maybe a lot of it will, maybe some of it won't. But I would say that, I can say pretty confidently that these rules, this is sort of these rules, and I would say this pathway, is really one of the aspects of Judaism that I most respect and admire. And something that is good to know about for when those moments come in our lives, so that we are sensitive to loved ones' memories, and we are also sensitive to our emotional needs as we journey through. So I thank all of you for listening, as always, for good questions. And next week, we'll be talking about something that's going to be very different in tone, the holiday of Purim, but there's a time for everything. And so please, hope to see you on Zoom for that, and then hopefully stick around for the congregational meeting that will immediately follow. So thank you so much, everybody, and wishing you a peaceful day and a good 3-day weekend.
Have a
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All right, take care, everybody.